we're talking about here. You want to play like games.
I'm not playing no game with you, man.
Kirkland killed 13-year-old Esme Kenny, 14-year-old Cassandra Crawford, as well as 45-year-old Mary Jo Newton and 25-year-old Kim Rollison.
Chad, where are Lori's kids? Listen, just tell people what's happening. There's people around the country praying for your children, praying for you guys. Why don't you give us answers?
That's great.
That's great.
When a judge hands down the death penalty, reactions can be chilling. Some criminals break down. Others sit in pure silence. But a few, they smile. They laugh. They show zero remorse. One killer, Chad Daybell's response was so twisted that it left the entire courtroom speechless. Let's step inside and witness the craziest murderers reacting to life sentences.
After years of appeals, a mother convicted of murdering her 2-year-old daughter, who has maintained her innocence, has been granted a stay just 2 days before she was set to be executed.
April 2007, Harlingen, Texas. The panicked voice of Melissa Lucio crackled through the 911 call. Her 2-year-old daughter, Mariah, wasn't breathing. When paramedics arrived, they found the toddler lifeless, bruises darkening her fragile body. Melissa told them it was a terrible accident. Mariah had fallen down the stairs days before. But as investigators scanned the room and studied Mariah's battered body, they weren't convinced. Hours later, Melissa sat in a sterile interrogation room. The clock ticked past 7 hours as detectives hurled question after question, accusing her of murder. Exhausted, broken, and without a lawyer, Melissa muttered, "I guess I did it." To the detectives, that was all they needed. But to many, it was the start of a wrongful conviction that would send a mother to death row. At trial, prosecutors portrayed Melissa as a violent, unstable mother who had taken her anger out on her youngest child. They zeroed in on her 7-hour confession, playing it for the jury. Melissa's face was blank, her voice flat, but her words sealed her fate.
And the interrogation continued for maybe 7 hours until 3 o'clock in the morning.
They presented Mariah's injuries, bruises, bite marks, and internal bleeding as clear signs of harm. The jury saw a mother who didn't cry on the 911 call, who sat motionless in court. But what the jury never heard was that Melissa had survived a lifetime of domestic violence, from her own mother, from partners, and even from the father of her children. They didn't know that Melissa had been pregnant with twins when Mariah died, emotionally fragile and overwhelmed. And they didn't hear from experts who could have explained how coerced confessions, especially from vulnerable women, happen all the time. In the end, it didn't matter. After just 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a sentence: death. Melissa Lucio became the first Latina woman on Texas death row. For 15 years, she sat in isolation, fighting for her life as appeals were denied one after another. But as her execution date approached in April 2022, the world finally took notice.
1 week from today, Texas plans to execute Melissa Lucio for the death of her daughter, despite widespread concern she's innocent.
The Innocence Project, celebrities like Kim Kardashian, and even bipartisan lawmakers rallied behind her, pointing to the weak evidence and the glaring flaws in her trial. Pressure mounted. Then, in a stunning turn just 48 hours before she was scheduled to die, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals halted the execution. The reason? Critical evidence that had been withheld from her original trial. Evidence that could have changed everything. But when the stay of execution was granted years later, Melissa, speaking from death row, described it as being pulled from the edge of a cliff. But only just. She was still on death row, still waiting. Melissa Lucio's case has become a lightning rod for debates over the death penalty, the treatment of domestic survivors, and the dangers of coerced confessions. Some see her as a mother who failed her child in the worst way. Others see her as a victim of a broken system that ignores context, trauma, and truth. But one thing is certain, her death sentence didn't just shatter her life. It sent shockwaves through Texas and forced the world to question what justice really looks like. For now, she remains trapped between life and death, her fate still hanging in limbo. A mother's quiet tears left the courtroom divided. But in our next case, there was no composure. When this convicted killer heard his death sentence, his reaction left the entire courtroom reeling.
We're talking about here. You want to play like games.
I'm not playing no game with you, man.
Kirkland killed 13-year-old Esme Kenny, 14-year-old Cassandra Crawford, as well as 45-year-old Mary Jo Newton and 25-year-old Kimya Rollison.
It was a warm spring evening in Cincinnati, 2006, when 14-year-old Cassandra Crawford headed out for a walk, never knowing it would be her last. She vanished into the fading daylight. No witnesses, no warning. Days later, when her body was discovered hidden in a wooded lot, the community was gripped with horror. But this wasn't an isolated tragedy. This was the work of a man who had been hiding in plain sight, a predator who had already killed before and wasn't finished yet. For years, he stalked the streets, blending into the background, while police struggled to connect the growing string of deaths. It wasn't until his final mistake that the full scale of Anthony Kirkland's twisted crimes were exposed. And when the judge handed down the ultimate punishment, his reaction left the entire courtroom stunned.
Confronted 13-year-old Esme Kenny as she was out for a jog, and you'll see that the defendant strangled her, burned her body, and left the scene.
Anthony Kirkland's trail of destruction didn't begin with Cassandra Crawford. Nearly 2 decades earlier, in 1987, he killed his girlfriend in a violent outburst, setting her body on fire in an attempt to destroy the evidence. He was sentenced to prison, but the justice system gave him a second chance he never should have had. In 2004, after serving just 16 years, Kirkland was granted parole, and within months of his release, the killings began again. Between 2006 and 2009, 4 more victims fell into his path. The community was unaware that a serial killer was quietly building his body count, each crime escalating in brutality. But Kirkland had a signature, one the police wouldn't fully piece together until it was too late. His method was calculated. He targeted vulnerable women and young girls, strangled them, and then set their bodies on fire to erase any trace of what he'd done. The city remained unaware of the predator in their midst, until 13-year-old Esme Kenny went for a jog one spring afternoon in 2009 and never came home. Her disappearance triggered a frantic search. Hours into the hunt, police noticed a man loitering near the crime scene, sweating, disheveled, and oddly calm. It was Anthony Kirkland. Officers questioned him, uneasy with his strange behavior, and when his alibi crumbled, they brought him in. It didn't take long before the truth came pouring out. In the interrogation room, Kirkland's cold composure was chilling. He sat there, his voice flat, detailing his crimes without a flicker of remorse. When detectives brought up Esme Kenny, the mask finally slipped. The timeline of his brutal attack fit perfectly with the evidence they had gathered. Her body had been found not far from where Kirkland was stalked, hidden in a wooded area. But Esme wasn't his only confession. In that sterile room, Kirkland unraveled the twisted web he'd built, admitting to the murders of Cassandra Crawford, Kimya Rollison, and Mary Jo Newton.
Anthony Kirkland has now admitted to killing 4 women, choking 3 of them, and stabbing the 4th. Testimony came during his 8-hour interview with police.
The trial that followed was a deep dive into Kirkland's darkness. The prosecution painted a clear picture of a man who preyed on the vulnerable, a predator who stalked his victims before striking with brutal force. The courtroom was packed. Families of the victims sat shoulder to shoulder, listening in horror as each detail was laid bare. And then came the moment they'd all been waiting for. The judge prepared to read the sentence. The room held its breath. As the words death penalty echoed through the courtroom, Kirkland didn't flinch. He sat there, silently. Not a twitch of fear, not a hint of regret. Just cold satisfaction, as if he'd beaten the system in his own twisted way. Anthony Kirkland was sentenced to death for the murders of Cassandra Crawford and Esme Kenny, and life in prison without parole for the killings of Kimya Rollison and Mary Jo Newton.
I want you to die slowly, but it's not going to happen. They go put that needle in you, and you go quick. But you tortured them children. You tortured everybody.
But Kirkland wasn't done trying to play the system. In 2016, his legal team filed for a resentencing hearing, arguing that his previous defense hadn't properly represented him. It forced the victims' families back into court, reopening wounds they had tried to heal. For days, they sat through the same gruesome details. Kirkland barely reacted, watching the proceedings with that same empty stare. In the end, the court upheld the death sentence, but not before forcing everyone back into the nightmare. In the courtroom, emotions boiled over. Families of the victims openly wept, while others seethed with rage at Kirkland's sheer lack of remorse.
Her father is devastated. He cannot and will not look you in your face. And you should be really grateful for that.
When Esme Kenny's mother stood to speak, the room fell into heavy silence. Her voice trembled as she described her daughter's innocence, her love for books, her quiet nature, and how Kirkland had ripped it all away. Her words cracked through the coldness of the room, but Kirkland sat there, unmoved, his face betraying nothing. The judge didn't hold back either, as he reaffirmed the death penalty. He called Kirkland's crimes calculated evil, but still there was no sign of regret. Kirkland left the room with that same faint smile. It was a reaction that haunted the families long after the trial ended, a look that seemed to say he was still in control. A killer who smiled at death. But in our next case, the horror wasn't uncovered in a courtroom. It was found in the most unthinkable place, when police opened the trunk of a car and found the unimaginable.
Police believe he hid the bodies for weeks after killing them in their Marion County home.
Now he's charged with killing his wife, and other charges may come depending on the autopsy results.
It was supposed to be a routine traffic stop, nothing out of the ordinary. But when officers pulled over a minivan in Georgia in September 2019, what they found inside changed everything.
All we need to know is that's evil, and evil did something. And evil needs to pay for what he did. Plain and simple as that.
The stench hit them first, a thick, sickly odor that seeped from the back of the vehicle. And then when they popped the trunk, the truth spilled out. A body, wrapped, decomposing. The man behind the wheel, calm, almost too calm. And before officers could even ask, he muttered something that would leave them frozen in place. You might want to check the house. What they found next would haunt even the most seasoned investigators. Michael Wayne Jones Jr. wasn't a stranger to the law. Behind the mask of a family man was a history of violence, control, and a string of warning signs that had been overlooked. Neighbors in Summerfield, Florida described the Jones household as tense. Something always felt off, but nothing could have prepared them for what was happening behind closed doors. Michael was married to Casey Jones, a devoted mother of 4. Friends noticed the shift in her over time. She grew quieter, more withdrawn, trapped in a life that seemed to be spiraling. But no one imagined the danger she was in. In late August 2019, family members began losing touch with Casey. Calls went unanswered, messages read but ignored. Her mother grew increasingly worried. Casey never went this long without checking in. Then, in early September, panic fully set in. Casey's mother filed a missing person report, and by then, it was already too late. The minivan that reeked of death had been carrying a grim secret, the body of Casey Jones, decomposing for weeks, as Michael drove state to state, trying to figure out his next move. But the horror didn't end there. When police followed up on Michael's chilling suggestion to check the house, they entered the family home in Florida, only to uncover a scene straight from a nightmare. Inside, they found the remains of 4 children, Casey's kids, hidden and lifeless. Cameron, 10, Preston, 5, Mercalli, 2, and Ayanna, 1, all gone. The reality hit investigators hard. Michael Wayne Jones hadn't just taken the life of his wife. He had murdered his entire family and had been living with their bodies for weeks. During his confession, Michael casually explained how the violence began. An argument with Casey spiraled out of control, and he struck her with a baseball bat. She didn't survive. After that, he turned on the children, one by one, ending their lives before attempting to cover it all up. But his escape plan was sloppy. For weeks, he drove around with Casey's body in his van, the smell growing worse until it became impossible to hide. It was only a matter of time before he slipped up, and that minor car accident in Georgia sealed his fate.
Now, as far as I'm concerned, as the sheriff of this county, underneath the jail ain't good enough. He has no right to walk the face of this earth.
In the courtroom, the sheer scale of Michael's crimes was hard to process. Prosecutors didn't hold back. They painted him as a cold, calculating killer who not only took the lives of 5 innocent people, but also tried to erase their existence. The jury took just days to come to a decision. In January 2023, Michael Wayne Jones Jr. was sentenced to death for the murder of his wife, and life sentences for the murders of all 4 children. The courtroom was thick with tension as the judge read the sentence.
Clue what had gone through his mind to say, I don't know what went through his head to say I need to do this.
Family members of Casey Jones sat in the gallery, some openly sobbing, others frozen in shock. The weight of what had been taken from them was almost too heavy to bear. Michael, on the other hand, sat still, his face blank. No tears, no apologies, just a cold, hollow stare, like he was detached from the reality of what he'd done. Michael's complete lack of remorse was haunting. For many in that room, justice had been served, but it didn't bring peace. 5 lives were gone, and no sentence could fill that void. A father who destroyed his entire family. But in our next case is even more disturbing. It's not about revenge or jealousy. It's about unimaginable cruelty towards an innocent child.
She can change her story as many times as she wants, but the reality is she participated, she directed it. Who knows? I mean, she did what she did, and she knew better.
On May 24th, 2013, emergency responders rushed to a hospital in Palmdale, California, carrying the fragile body of an 8-year-old boy. His injuries were so severe that doctors struggled to comprehend the horror he had endured. His name was Gabriel Fernandez. Behind closed doors, his mother, Pearl Fernandez, and her boyfriend, Isauro Aguirre, had turned his home into a house of torment. 2 days earlier, they had mistreated him so brutally that he lost consciousness. Gabriel's struggles were not hidden. For 8 months, teachers and others raised concerns about his well-being to social workers and law enforcement. Scrapes, bruises, and other injuries were clear signs that something wasn't right. However, despite these warnings, officials failed to intervene. Gabriel remained in the home, and the challenges he faced continued. Before living with his mother in Aguirre, Gabriel was cared for by his great-uncle and later by his grandparents. His life took a difficult turn when Pearl regained custody in 2012. From that point on, he endured a lot of hardships, facing constant mistreatment and being forced to do things no child should ever experience. At night, he was forced to stay inside a small cabinet. His mother and her boyfriend treated him unkindly, often making fun of him and causing him harm. Aguirre, in particular, seemed to single out Gabriel due to his personal beliefs about the boy. On May 22, 2013, the cruelty reached its peak when Gabriel was punished simply for not putting away his toys. This time, the injuries were too severe. He became unresponsive, and Pearl finally called 911.
My son is not breathing.
Your son is what?
He's not breathing.
He just was unconscious.
Okay, do you have the paramedics on the way right now? Are you right there with him?
Yes, I'm right here.
Paramedics rushed him to the hospital, but his injuries were too severe to heal. He was declared brain dead and sadly passed away 2 days later. His autopsy revealed signs of serious harm and neglect, showing the hardships he had endured for a long time. Pearl Fernandez and Isauro Aguirre were arrested the day after Gabriel was taken to the hospital. Initially, Pearl faced felony child endangerment, while Aguirre was charged with attempted murder. However, when Gabriel died, the charges escalated to first-degree murder with special circumstances of torture. At trial, prosecutors described Aguirre as pure evil. The jury agreed, and the judge said, "The conduct was animalistic, but that could be wrong because even animals know how to take care of their young." He was found guilty and sentenced to death. Pearl, on the other hand, took a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole, but showed no shame for her heinous act.
The mother of 8-year-old Gabriel Fernandez, who was beaten and tortured to death in 2013, will stay in prison.
Gabriel's story is a painful reminder of what happens when a child's cries for help go unheard. His tragic death shook the nation, sparking outrage and calls for reform in child protective services. His short life was filled with suffering, but his memory continues to inspire change. No child should ever endure what Gabriel went through. His story must never be forgotten. In honor of Gabriel, people celebrate his 18th birthday in remembrance. A killer who sat cold and still as the death sentence was read. But in our next case, the killer couldn't hide his true emotions. When the judge revealed his fate, he let out a chilling smile that left the entire courtroom stunned.
Chad, where are Lori's kids? Listen, just tell people what's happening. There's people around the country praying for your children, praying for you guys. Why don't you give us answers?
That's great.
That's great.
It started with 2 missing kids. Tylee Ryan, 16, and her little brother, JJ Vallow, just 7 years old, seemed to vanish without a trace in late 2019. Their mother, Lori Vallow, barely flinched. Her new husband, Chad Daybell, was even colder. Calm, detached, and eerily quiet as the search intensified. But when investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a twisted world of doomsday prophecies, cult-like beliefs, and a dark obsession with the end of the world. And Chad Daybell? He wasn't just some passive figure in the background. He was the mastermind. Chad Daybell wasn't your typical criminal. On the surface, he was a small-town author in Idaho, writing books about the apocalypse and near-death experiences. But beneath that calm, quiet persona was something much darker.
While attending a prepper convention, Daybell was approached by a blonde-haired, blue-eyed fan named Lori Vallow. The two hit it off and started having an affair.
In 2018, Chad met Lori Vallow, a woman who shared his end-of-the-world beliefs. Their connection was instant, but as their relationship deepened, so too did their obsession with cleansing the world of what they called dark spirits. And soon, the people closest to them started turning up dead. In July 2019, Lori's husband, Charles Vallow, was shot and killed by her brother, who claimed it was self-defense. Months later, in October 2019, Chad's wife, Tammy Daybell, died suddenly in her sleep. At first, it was ruled natural causes, but investigators would later find out otherwise. With their spouses gone, Chad and Lori married just 2 weeks after Tammy's death. But there was a bigger problem: Tylee and JJ. By late September 2019, both children had vanished. Lori kept making excuses. JJ was safe. Tylee was off at college. But when police demanded proof the kids were alive, Lori and Chad fled to Hawaii. The truth: the kids had been gone for months. On June 9, 2020, everything came crashing down. Armed with a search warrant, investigators dug through Chad Daybell's backyard in Rexburg, Idaho. Hours passed with nothing. Then, they struck something. Beneath a thin layer of soil, police unearthed JJ Vallow's body, wrapped in black plastic and bound with duct tape. Nearby, they found the burned and dismembered remains of Tylee Ryan, hidden in a shallow grave. Chad Daybell, who had been watching from his front porch, was immediately arrested. The evidence was staggering. Text messages, phone records, and even Chad's own writings showed how deeply he believed in his twisted mission. In his mind, JJ and Tylee weren't kids. They were zombies whose spirits needed to be freed. The public was horrified. 2 innocent children had been killed, buried in their stepfather's backyard, all in the name of a doomsday prophecy. Chad Daybell's trial was a media circus. Prosecutors painted him as a manipulative cult leader who twisted religious beliefs into a weapon. They described how he dehumanized JJ and Tylee, labeling them as dark spirits to justify the unthinkable.
Daybell, this religious author who wrote about end of days and dark spirits. In fact, prosecutors have presented evidence that show Lori and Chad seem to use religion as a motivation to kill.
Lori Vallow had already been convicted and sentenced to life without parole. Now it was Chad's turn to face the consequences. In May 2024, after weeks of graphic testimony and damning evidence, the jury found Chad Daybell guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder for Tylee, JJ, and his wife Tammy, as well as multiple counts of conspiracy. The final decision? Death penalty. But it was what happened next that sent chills through the courtroom. When the judge read the sentence, the courtroom was heavy with emotion. Family members of the victims sat in tears, some unable to even look at Chad. But Chad Daybell, he didn't flinch. He didn't cry. Instead, as the judge uttered the words "sentenced to death," Chad sat still with a cold, blank expression, as if he saw it all as part of some grand plan. Even the judge paused, seemingly caught off guard by Chad's eerie calm. For the families, the verdict was justice, but it would never bring back JJ or Tylee. And as Chad Daybell was led out of the courtroom, still wearing that haunting smile, it was clear he didn't regret a thing. Up next, Steven Lorenzo, a predator whose horrifying crimes left a trail of devastation. What led to his reign of terror? And how did justice finally catch up with him?
The death penalty and nothing less.
What he did to my son before murdering him should be done to him. Eye for an eye.
In 2003, 2 young men, Jason Galehouse and Michael Wachholz, vanished from Tampa's vibrant community. Their families and friends hoped they would return safely, but those hopes were soon shattered when the truth about their fate was revealed. Jason and Michael were last seen alive in December 2003. Their sudden disappearance alarmed their loved ones, but no one could have imagined the horror they endured. Days later, Michael's body was found in his car in an apartment complex parking lot. Jason, however, was never found. Investigators later learned that he had been dismembered and his remains were discarded in dumpsters, making it impossible to recover his body. As police dug deeper into the case, they uncovered disturbing details. Steven Lorenzo used dating apps and bars to meet his victims, often targeting those who were trusting and unsuspecting. Investigators found unsettling evidence on his computer, along with items in his home that raised serious concerns. Steven Lorenzo and his accomplice, Scott Schweikert, had devised a scheme to manipulate and harm their victims. Their actions left a lasting impact on the lives of many and shocked the entire community.
After Mr. Galehouse was killed,
his body was wrapped and put on a trailer in the driveway of Mr. Lorenzo's home.
Scott Schweikert, Lorenzo's accomplice, was a middle-aged man from Illinois who shared Lorenzo's sadistic interests. He later cooperated with investigators, providing detailed accounts of how the two planned and carried out their crimes, with Lorenzo taking the lead. Schweikert's testimony became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, as he described the horrifying events that had taken place. A survivor, Albert Perkins, testified about his harrowing experience with Lorenzo. He recounted waking up restrained and unable to call for help. Despite the fear he endured, Albert bravely took the stand to share his story, shedding light on Lorenzo's harmful actions. His testimony was instrumental in exposing the extent of Lorenzo's cruelty and bringing the truth to light. For nearly 20 years, the victims' families waited for justice. Then, in December 2022, Steven Lorenzo finally admitted to his crimes. At his sentencing hearing, he shocked everyone by welcoming the death penalty.
I'm seeking the death penalty. It's in my best interest, basically, because it's a comfort. The sooner I can fetch myself a new body and come back again.
But the judge, Christopher Sabella, made it clear that his decision had nothing to do with Lorenzo's wishes. "This is the punishment you deserve for these horrific crimes," he declared. Jason Galehouse's mother, Pam Williams, who was battling terminal cancer, confronted Lorenzo in court with raw emotion. "I'm sick to my stomach just having to look at your disgusting face," she told him. Alongside her was Ruth Wachholz, Michael's mother, who had also waited 2 decades for this moment. On February 24, 2023, Steven Lorenzo was sentenced to death. The courtroom was filled with emotions, relief, grief, and a sense of long overdue justice. Judge Sabella acknowledged the victims' families' pain, saying, "The thing that was consistent in their testimony is that they have been waiting 20 years for justice. Today, that long wait ends."
Ti condanno a morte. That translates to, I sentence you, Mr. Lorenzo, to death.
Though nothing can bring back Jason and Michael, their families can finally find some closure, knowing that the men responsible for their suffering will never harm another soul again. Lorenzo's case exposed a predator driven by cruelty. The next case shows that sometimes the most dangerous individuals aren't just killers. They're ideologues willing to take innocent lives for their own twisted beliefs.
After I found out he's getting the death penalty, I went outside and I hugged my friends and I started crying and I was just glad it was over.
On April 13, 2014, a quiet afternoon in Overland Park, Kansas turned into a scene of horror. Frazier Glenn Miller Jr., an 80-year-old man with a long history of controversial beliefs, tragically carried out an attack outside a Jewish community center and a nearby retirement home. His attack left 3 innocent people dead, none of whom were Jewish, despite his hateful intentions. Miller's path to violence started long before that day. Born in 1940, he once served as a U.S. Army veteran, but later in life, he became involved with divisive and controversial organizations. In the 1980s, he established a group called the White Patriot Party, which promoted exclusionary ideas and beliefs. He even sought public office to share his extreme viewpoints. He even ran for public office, hoping to spread his extreme beliefs. However, his activities eventually led to his arrest in 1987, when authorities found a stockpile of illegal weapons and explosives in his possession. He served time in prison, but never let go of his extremist views. By 2014, Miller was in poor health and believed he was dying. Instead of spending his last years peacefully, he planned a deadly attack. On that fateful April day, he drove to the Jewish Community Center and fired shots at people in the parking lot. He then moved to a nearby retirement home, continuing his rampage. His victims, William Corcoran and his 14-year-old grandson, Reet Underwood, were there for a singing competition. The third victim, Terry Lamano, was visiting her mother. They were Christians, not Jewish, proof that Miller's hatred was as senseless as his crime. After his arrest, Miller showed no guilt and appeared in court in a wheelchair. He shouted hateful slogans and even tried to justify his actions during his trial. The court found him guilty of capital murder and multiple other charges. A Kansas jury sentenced him to death, a punishment he openly accepted, claiming he was proud of what he did and said thank you. Miller remained on death row until May 3, 2021, when he died in prison at the age of 80. Officials stated that his death was due to natural causes. Though his life ended behind bars, the pain he caused to the victims' families remains. The story of Frazier Glenn Miller Jr. is a reminder of the dangers of hate and extremism. Innocent lives were lost because of one man's violent ideology. But in the end, justice prevailed, ensuring that his actions did not go unanswered. Our next case shows that sometimes the motive is even more chilling: senseless cruelty with no reason at all.
His internal life
is going to be way worse than whatever he will deal with in this lifetime.
I didn't attend any of the court hearings. I couldn't bear to watch what my grandson endured before he was shot.
On November 11, 2022, 21-year-old Bryce Salter spent his evening at Y Bar and Bistro in Kalamazoo, Michigan. It was supposed to be just another night out, but when the evening came to an end, Bryce never made his way home. Hours passed and his family grew concerned. They didn't know that something terrible had happened outside the bar that night. Based on the information the press could gather, authorities were soon involved, and an investigation began into what had taken place. Bryce Salter was a young man full of life, known for his love of sports and fishing. He had a smile that could light up a room, according to his grandmother, Brenda Miles. But in just moments, his life was stolen by Lange, a man who had spent most of his adult life in and out of prison. Lange had been out of prison for only a few months when he managed to obtain a stolen gun. On that tragic night, he used it to take Bryce's life. The murder was brutal and completely unprovoked. He tragically shot and killed Salter. Surveillance footage revealed that Lange approached his car, where he encountered Salter. An argument ensued, during which Lange pointed a gun at Salter's chest, knocking him to the ground. Salter attempted to defend himself, but Lange fired multiple shots, resulting in Salter's death. Bryce's father, Brandon Salter, and other family members struggled to comprehend how someone could be so cruel. But what made the case even more disturbing was Lange's behavior during the trial.
Say surveillance video shows the two men arguing when Lange took out a gun and knocked Salter to the ground. Salter fought back, but then Lange shot him.
Lange showed no shame for what he had done. During his sentencing hearing, he laughed as Bryce's family members delivered emotional victim impact statements. He mocked their pain, slumped in his chair, and smirked while Bryce's younger sister, Reese, spoke about how much her brother meant to her. Even after receiving his sentence, a minimum of 100 years in prison, Lange continued to smile. His attitude throughout the trial shocked not only Bryce's family but also the judge, who called Lange's actions senseless, cowardly, and merciless. Despite Lange's disturbing behavior, justice was served. The court handed him a sentence that ensured he would never walk free again. In addition to the 100-year sentence for second-degree murder, Lange received additional time for weapons charges. As the judge announced the verdict, the Salter family clapped with joy as Lange was sentenced.
70 years to a maximum of 100 years. Thank you.
As bailiffs dragged Lange out of the courtroom for his aggressive outbursts, one of Bryce's family members shouted, "How does it feel to know you're going to die in prison?" It was a powerful moment, one that brought a sense of closure to those who had suffered so much. Bryce's father, Brandon, called his son magic and said he had the perfect blend of everything: intelligence, kindness, and charm. His loss left a hole in their hearts that could never be filled. Bryce's sister Reese found the trial to be one of the hardest experiences of her life. Hearing the details of her brother's final moments was devastating, but seeing Lange mock their pain was even worse. In the end, the Salter family found some comfort in knowing that Lange would never harm another person again. While their pain will never fully fade, they could finally say that justice had been served for Bryce. Lange's lack of remorse was gut-wrenching, but what if a killer not only showed no regret but actively mocked the justice system? That's exactly what happened in our next case.
I didn't kill anyone. I'm not spending the rest of my life in prison for something I didn't do.
In 2007, the quiet town of Elyria, Ohio was shattered by a crime that no one saw coming. Dave Kowalczyk, the well-loved owner of Granny D's Pizza, was found murdered, a brutal and calculated act that sent shockwaves through the community. However, the true horror wasn't just in the crime itself, it was in the man behind it. Neil Simpson wasn't just a killer, he was cold, unrepentant, and dangerous. It started when Dave Kowalczyk's body was found in the pizza shop's back room, his hands tied behind his back. Police discovered security footage showing Simpson entering the shop that night. Investigators tracked Simpson to a nearby motel, where he was arrested within 48 hours. As the trial began, his chilling lack of remorse became clear. He didn't just deny his actions, he mocked the very system trying to bring him to justice. Spitting on jurors, hurling profanities, and showing no sign of regret, Simpson proved one thing: he wasn't sorry, and he never would be. From the beginning, the prosecution painted Simpson as a dangerous man. He had a history of trouble, a personality disorder, and a reputation for making reckless decisions. On the night of the murder, he was the leader of the group, the one in control. It was his plan, his decisions, and ultimately his actions that led to Kowalczyk's mourning death. The prosecution argued that the crime was deliberate, not impulsive. Simpson's past made him a threat to society, and they pushed for the death penalty. The defense, however, tried to shift the focus. They claimed his troubled childhood played a role in his actions. They argued that his upbringing shaped him into the man he became, and that should be considered in his sentencing. As the jury delivered their verdict, Simpson's face twisted with rage. Overcome with fury, he did the unthinkable. He spat at the jurors. Gasps echoed through the courtroom as officers swiftly escorted him out. His lawyers, scrambling to salvage the situation, pleaded for a mistrial, but the judge stood firm. 2 hours later, Simpson returned, his demeanor calmer, but his anger still simmering beneath the surface. He turned to the judge and offered an apology, but not to the jury. "I'm not mad at you," he admitted, his voice steady. "I'm mad at them." The courtroom was thick with tension as the jury left to deliberate. When Neil was seeking the death penalty for himself, hours passed, each minute stretching endlessly for Dave Kowalczyk's family. Would they choose the ultimate punishment? Would Neil Simpson be sent to death row for his brutal crime? After 4 agonizing hours, the jury returned. The room fell silent as Judge Mark Betleski prepared to read the verdict. Kowalczyk's family held their breath. Simpson, appearing through a grainy video feed from jail, sat motionless. His freshly shaven head and cold expression betrayed nothing. Then, the words came. Life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Due to election by the state of Ohio, on count 2, life in prison without the possibility of parole.
This was justice, but it would never bring Dave back. However, Simpson didn't flinch. No reaction, no shame. Just the same blank stare, as if he had already resigned himself to his fate. A life behind bars, with nothing but time to think about the choices that led him there. Though he avoided the death penalty, his defense attorney believed the outcome was worse for him. Life in prison meant no second chances, no hope for freedom. While a death sentence would have given him years of appeals, this verdict left him with only one. His fight for freedom was effectively over. The prosecution stood by the jury's decision, calling it fair and just. The case was closed, and the community could finally move forward. This case is heartbreaking in many ways. A hardworking man lost his life over a senseless crime, leaving his family and loved ones in grief. The trial itself was difficult to watch, especially given Simpson's lack of repentance. While the justice system ensured he would never harm another person again, no sentence could truly make up for the loss of Dave Kowalczyk. His family will carry that pain forever. Neil Simpson may have escaped death row, but he'll spend the rest of his days behind bars, alone, with nothing but time to think about what he's done. The next case reveals how a man who was supposed to save lives turned into a cold-blooded murderer.
Meditated that there are any number of cases in which a defendant was sentenced to death in Nebraska where the prior conduct did not rise to the level of disregard this defendant has for the value of the life of another human being.
Anthony Garcia was once a promising medical student, but his career took a dark turn. Instead of saving lives, he ended up taking them. Between 2008 and 2013, he committed 2 separate double murders in Omaha, Nebraska. His victims were connected to his past failures, and his crimes shocked the community. Garcia had a troubling history in the medical field. After earning his degree, he struggled through multiple residencies, often being forced out due to unprofessional behavior. His time at Creighton University Medical Center was particularly disastrous. His professors found him arrogant and irresponsible, and he was eventually dismissed. Dr. William Hunter and Dr. Roger Brumbach, 2 senior figures at Creighton, played key roles in his termination. Years later, Garcia still held a grudge. Unable to build a successful medical career, he blamed those who had dismissed him. Then, in 2008, an unimaginable tragedy struck. On March 13, 2008, Dr. William Hunter returned home to find a horrifying scene. His 11-year-old son, Thomas Hunter, and the family's housekeeper, Shirley Sherman, had been brutally stabbed to death. The attack shook the community, but investigators struggled to find a suspect. Witnesses had seen a heavy-set man in a silver Honda near the home, but the case quickly went cold. For 5 years, the families had no answers. Then, in 2013, the killer struck again. On May 14, 2013, Dr. Roger and Mary Brumbach were found murdered in their home. Roger had been shot multiple times and stabbed, while Mary had been stabbed to death. Once again, knives from the victim's kitchen had been used. Investigators immediately noticed the similarities to the 2008 murders. Their suspicions grew stronger when they discovered an attempted break-in at the home of Dr. Chanda Butra, another former Creighton professor who had classed with Garcia. It became clear that the killer was targeting former colleagues. Detectives began digging deeper into Garcia's background. They discovered that just before the Brumbach's murders, he had purchased a firearm matching the type used in the crime. His credit card records placed him near the crime scene, and his phone had been used to search for the Brumbach address. On July 15, 2013, authorities arrested Garcia while he was driving in Illinois. He was heavily intoxicated, and inside his car, police found a handgun. He was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder.
Finally, in the fall of 2016, a trial. After 16 days of testimony, a jury found Garcia guilty of all 4 murders.
Garcia's trial began in October 2016. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including DNA, surveillance footage, and even a chilling confession to an acquaintance where he bragged about killing a young boy and an older woman. Garcia showed little emotion throughout the trial, often wearing headphones and appearing uninterested. After weeks of testimony, the jury found him guilty on all counts. In September 2018, a panel of judges sentenced him to death.
Asleep or catatonic. That's how the attorney for revenge killer Anthony Garcia, eyes closed, hands cuffed. He had no reaction, barely any movement during the testimony.
He remained silent and even slept when the judge announced his death penalty. His crimes had been calculated, brutal, and fueled by revenge. The case of Anthony Garcia is a chilling reminder of how bitterness and resentment can turn deadly. Instead of moving on from his failures, he chose to take innocent lives. His victims were people who had once been part of his world, yet he saw them as obstacles rather than human beings. For the families of Thomas Hunter, Shirley Sherman, Roger Brumbach, and Mary Brumbach, justice was served, but their pain remains. No sentence can bring back their loved ones, but at least the man responsible can never harm anyone again. From cold stares to twisted smiles, these killers faced their final judgment, but their chilling courtroom reactions left the world speechless. And these are just a fraction of the cases that continue to haunt the justice system. The next video on screen dives even deeper into unthinkable crimes, jaw-dropping verdicts, and the courtroom moments that no one saw coming. Keep watching, because some stories are far darker than you ever imagined.